Welcome to Suddenly Different, where we explore stories and strategies for life when it doesn't go to plan. I'm Leigh-Anne Charland, inviting you to join me on this journey. What do you do when the life you worked so hard to build is rewritten in a single moment? At just 24, Lisa Cox was at the height of her career in advertising when a sudden brain hemorrhage stopped everything. She died twice, spent 3 weeks in a coma, endured over a dozen surgeries, including amputations, lost vision, lost time, lost certainty. And yet she re-emerged, not just as a survivor, but as a disruptor, a voice, a strategist, a change maker. Lisa is now multi-award-winning author, media professional, TEDx speaker, and fierce advocate for inclusion done right. Not as a feel-good checkbox, but as a business imperative and a cultural necessity. Her lived experience of disability, combined with deep industry insight, is helping reshape how we see ability, representation, and leadership. In today's conversation, we explore what it means to be suddenly different, not just physically, but socially, professionally, and spiritually, and how to reclaim agency when the world has already decided what you're worth. Welcome, Lisa, to Suddenly Different.
Hello. It's really great to be here with you today.
We did a few months ago record a podcast, but unfortunately at that time my technical capacity was not what it needed to be. So now we get to have a deeper and more meaningful conversation than the one we had last time, although my heart was open after speaking with Lisa.
That was a great conversation last time. And like you said, we get to go even further this time. So look forward to it.
Wonderful. So let's go. Lisa, let's begin with your suddenly different moment. What happened that day at Tullamarine Airport? And what do you remember about who you were before then?
Well, I remember nothing of that day. So I relied a lot on conversations from everybody who was around me. So to set the scene, I'd gone to Tullamarine Airport in Melbourne. I was flying home to see my family. It was sometime in the morning, and airport staff noticed that I was struggling with words, struggling to move in a coordinated fashion. Next thing, I collapsed. So they, of course, called the ambulance, took me to hospital, found out that I'd had a stroke or a brain bleed, a brain hemorrhage. And from there, it all snowballed. I spent the next 3 weeks in a coma, 2 months on life support, and over a year in hospital. And my family were called down that day. They got in touch with them and said, "You need to get to Melbourne. We don't know if Lisa will be alive in the morning." So they came to Melbourne, obviously, and spent the next 2 months by my bedside in intensive care in Melbourne. And unfortunately, I don't remember the months before and after the stroke, but a bit of amnesia is quite common for people who have a brain injury like mine. I do, however, remember my childhood, all of the fun memories from that, even my job, which was a copywriter in an advertising agency. So even though I didn't know what day it was, and I couldn't piece conversations together from 5 minutes ago, I could still write scripts in my head and knew everything about advertising and marketing and memories from when I was 5. So it was a really, really strange time. I slowly learned what happened, but not completely understanding it, because from what I knew, strokes was something that happened to old people, and I was 24, healthy, so I didn't have any of the usual risk factors like obesity or heavy smoking and drinking, all those sorts of things. So my family and I couldn't quite understand what had happened, but it was a streptococcus A virus or infection, that caused the brain hemorrhage. So that's how it all happened.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing, and I can only imagine how your family felt when they received the call that they needed to get to your bedside, and that there was this uncertainty around what was going to happen next.
That's right. I can't speak for them. They were obviously really traumatized. It was my sister who took the call. Mum and dad were not able to be reached at the time, but she got the call and then got everyone together to fly to Melbourne. And my brother was surfing at Byron Bay at the time, so he jumped in the car and came home. Somehow they all made it to Melbourne that night at about midnight, and then every day was going to the ward, not knowing if I'd survived through the night. So when they heard the machines beeping, as annoying as they were like, "Oh, great, she's still alive." And I'm still here today, 20 years later, annoying them all. So
Isn't that wonderful? I think that they would be delighted with every annoyance. So when you came out of your coma and you were still on life support, was that at the point that you became aware of what was sort of happening from a physical? No.
no, so I came off full life, or came out of my coma after 3 weeks. Came off life support after 2 months. At that point, I was medevaced or air ambulance back to Brisbane hospitals, and it was in the Brisbane hospitals. It was maybe another month before I started. Even though I was conscious and was apparently saying a few words, I remember none of that. My first recollection, my first memory is maybe 3-ish months after the stroke at a ward in a Brisbane hospital when I started piecing fragments together. This happened, then this happened, and could still remember my old life. But at that stage, I couldn't move anything. I could sort of wiggle my hands and blink my eyes. And for someone who did not stop moving, running around everywhere, that was really difficult to have a mind that wouldn't stop racing, but I couldn't pick up a pen to write things down or talk it out or anything like that. So that was about 3 months
Yeah.
after, but everything before that is a blur.
Wow. Isn't it amazing what our body will do to conserve the energy to fight for our life?
It is the body is amazing, and the human brain is amazing. Our bodies are far more incredible than we give them credit for, and I wish I'd I wish I'd given mine a lot more credit for the amazing things that it does when I was, in my 20s and getting sunburnt and abusing my liver with cheap champagne.
Well, absolutely. And we do that. But I think that I know I had a similar neurological incident that was much smaller than yours, but I know that my brain fog hung around for such a long time,
Yeah.
and the ability to speak, to remember what the start of the sentence was before I ended the sentence, that confusion.
Yeah, it's frustrating, especially for people who, like yourself, had a professional background and were quite capable of holding conversations and doing things, and all of a sudden you get halfway through a sentence and forget what you started saying, and people speak to you slowly, or like you've completely lost all ability, and that's infuriating as well. But so it is difficult to go from one thing to the state that I was in where I just couldn't hold a sentence and so much else.
As you were recovering, and I know that you had multiple operations and different interventions, at which point do you think you were going through the stages of grief, letting go of the memory of the person you were before and getting through those? I can't remember whether there's 5 stages or whatever, however many stages there are of grief.
So I think there was a certain point in time. There were certainly several points that I remember distinctly when I first found out I was going to have my leg amputated and then had to use a wheelchair and things like that. I was devastated, and in my mind was like, the wheelchair will be temporary. I'll get better and overcome this disability thing. And it was only several years afterwards, after my stroke, I'd been doing rehabilitation. That for me looked like practicing walking and going to the gym and doing all these things. And it finally dawned on me that I had so much internalized ableism, and wasn't going to be overcoming my disability. It was something that I had to learn to live with in harmony. And when the penny finally dropped on that, it's like, oh, life is wonderful. Why am I not? I've been blessed with this incredible second chance at life. Why don't I just try and enjoy that instead of trying to fit into society's mold of what normal should be? And I'm like, bugger it. Cultures are great. I love mine and mobility aids, all of those sorts of things. And when I had that little breakthrough, which was several years after the stroke, things definitely progressed for me positively after that.
That is a great awareness to share, because I know with me, I'm still going through the process of accepting the beauty of the things I can do. And it's not even forgiving. Forgiving's not the right word.
Yeah.
But accepting and being at peace and harmony with what I can't.
Yeah. So again, you and I both had professional backgrounds, and trying to return to that level of productivity was a big mistake that I made. It's okay that I can't do things to the same level I used to. I mean, I still do a lot of things. They just look different now, and they're not working in an advertising agency from 6 a.m. till 9 p.m. My version of productivity and ability to contribute to society just looks different. It's not better or worse or anything. It's just different.
It's different. And we're all different. We're all, we're different sizes, we're different colors, we're different genders. We're all different. And there is no perfect specimen. Like there's no such thing as 100% everything perfect. So we've got to let it go.
Exactly right. Yeah, and it's a huge weight off your shoulders, whether it's disability or something else, when you just make that choice to accept and live in harmony rather than try and either fix things or cure things. Or, I mean, I fell down the wellness rabbit hole for several years, and that was a big mistake. Thinking I could fix, quote unquote, myself with supplements or sunshine or something like that. And there's a place for those sorts of interventions. But when I worked out what I was doing, that again was another relief and took a lot of stress off my body.
Wonderful. So looking at your profession, so you worked in advertising, communications and branding, spaces obsessed with perfection. So how did you navigate those same spaces after becoming visibly disabled?
I suppose being obsessed with perfection, it wasn't the individual who had to be perfect. It was the brand and the product and the wording. So fortunately, my idea of worth and perfection, all of those things, was never tied to my physical body. So even though I was really upset when I, had my leg amputated, I'm covered in scars and missing pieces. Your audience can't see that. But because my self-worth wasn't really, really tied to being a perfect specimen, so to speak, it probably made things a little bit easier. However, my worth was tied to my work and what I did and what I contributed. So that was a little bit difficult, finding that, navigating my way back into the workforce. And there's all sorts of discrimination and ableism and things like that. But that's another conversation. Facing discrimination, I suppose, as someone with a disability, previously I'd been maybe the only female in a male-dominated industry or the youngest person in the boardroom. So I faced those sorts of things, which aren't really comparable to disability. I had sort of an idea of when people said things, I'm like, oh, I know what that means. Yeah, that had been my experience, I suppose, with discrimination. And I've got, privilege as a white, straight sized, non-disabled woman when I was, but now it was this whole new landscape with disability on top of that.
When we're looking at the current landscape and we're looking at more representation of disabled people in brand, so that people are looking at including a variety of different disabled people. And when you look at that beyond just an ethical fairness point of view, isn't there an economical reason why brands should include all elements of humanity in their branding?
There is, absolutely. And just speaking about disability, the disability market's worth over $13 trillion annually. That's globally speaking, that's not just people with disabilities, but our families, friends, supporters, colleagues, all those sorts of things. So we're not just talking about one or two people who've got a few things happening. That's a huge chunk of money. And having come from a business background pre-disability, I was like, well, there's a lot of talk out there about why it's just a nice thing to do and socially and morally good for society, and it absolutely is 100%. But if history taught us anything, it's that only saying that wasn't creating change. We needed to find another way to go about it. And I've spent enough time in boardrooms to know that a lot of the decision makers, when it comes to who gets seen, who gets heard in advertising, marketing, media, they want to know about the bottom of a profit and loss statement. What's there? What's the return on investment, the ROI? That's the stuff they're interested in. So we need to communicate to them as well as saying it's good for humanity. There's roughly 20% market share that brands and business were just essentially ignoring. And I've been criticized in the past, and I know other people have as well, for daring to talk about disability and money in the same sentence, or the consumer model of disability, as it's also called. But we're not talking about people with disabilities all suddenly going out and spending money on Mercedes and first class trips to Paris and everything. We're just talking about including people with disabilities in everyday things, advertising at Coles for frozen peas, frozen broccoli, because that's what we buy. We're consumers just for everyday things, basically. And if we are 20% of the community, roughly, give or take, then our media and communications need to reflect that. Because it's the media and communications which shape social attitudes and public perceptions and all the sorts of things that create employment opportunities, or when you go into the doctors, what the doctors predispose notions of disability are, all of those sorts of things, those public attitudes are shaped, and there's a lot of research to support this, shaped by things like media and advertising.
Well, I know when you look at the design of products, right, that women were excluded as a gender. Women were excluded from the design. So my understanding is airbags weren't as useful for women in their original design, and like because men were testing it and men were designing it. So now that we have more women involved in design, but considering disability when creating packaging, when creating venues, when creating anything, even when you're marketing, like making it easy for people to register that, is accessible to any different type of ability.
Correct. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yes. So you've said that disability doesn't mean less than, it means different. What myths or microaggressions do you find yourself still having to challenge even now?
There's the assumption that we're all a monolith. We all think the same, do the same, have the same opinions, political views, and things like that. And that could not be more far from the truth. So I have some very good friends who have different opinions to me on things, and that's fine. If everybody does in the non-disabled world, and the same is true in the disability world, even people who have the same diagnosis or the same mobility aids, my friend and I, who are both in a wheelchair, we are wildly different when it comes to so many things. And the assumption that we're all a monolith and we all want the same things or think the same things, that still happens today. I know really early on in my disability days, there were more assumptions. So I go to the gym several times a week, have been for years. And during my non-disability days, no one once said to me, so you're training for the Olympics. But once I started using a wheelchair in the gym, all of a sudden I got asked multiple times if I was going to the Paralympics. And that idea that someone with a disability who's physically active, that's the only thing we know about, or the only way people with disabilities are often portrayed is Paralympian or pitiful. So if you're not in hospital all day, every day, which I have been, then you must be a Paralympian. That's really the only two career paths, for want of a better word, the only two lives you could lead that I knew of with all the media I consumed over the years. I knew that wasn't for me. Where were all the ordinary people, being parents, studying, going to work, just doing everyday normal things? We don't see them in media, so we just assume that people with disabilities are either tragic victims in an insurance ad or Paralympians, and that's it. There's no in between.
Yes. And I know Dylan Alcott was working very hard on making sure that he was trying to have representation. He didn't have role models because there wasn't representation in television or in sport. So that was one of the driving elements that he had, was to increase that for young children who are disabled, and so that, you know, they can aspire to their absolute greatness.
In any industry, not just you must be a Paralympian because you have a disability, or you must, if they want to be a scientist or a social worker, a nurse, teacher, anything, having a disability is not a reason not to be able to do that. I suppose they don't just have to be pigeonholed into these disability stereotypes.
Absolutely. Well, you've made sure that you are not pigeonholed into anything as you are doing your PhD at the moment. But looking at, since your 24-year-old self, what strengths or insights have emerged that you would never have imagined would happen in your life since you were recovered from your initial situation?
Good question. I suppose if you told me when I was 23 that next year all these things are going to happen to you, you'll spend a year in hospital, have amputations, end up in a wheelchair, permanent brain injury, and you'll still be happy, meet and marry the most amazing man, and still love life. I was going, no way. You're talking about somebody else. You're joking. That to me was the worst imaginable thing that could happen. And I couldn't see any positives, any benefits. And I certainly don't want to sugarcoat disability because it's really rubbish for so many people. But there's this thing called the disability paradox, which says that two things can be true. You can have really tough times and disability, but you can also have absolute joy and happiness. And they've done research to show that people with really significant disabilities also reported living really fulfilled lives and were quite happy with their lives. So again, this coming back to this idea of how the media represents us, people see us only as tragic figures. So when people see me in the supermarket, they smile and tilt their head. Oh, you poor thing. Like I'm someone or something to be pitied. But I can't speak for everyone, but I love my life and don't apologize for that. Even I have significant challenges every day.
Yes. Yes, that's one of the things that each morning when I wake up, it's like, I'm happy, I'm joyous to be alive. You know, I'm here. There's more to be done. And if resting on the couch is one of the things to be done today, that's okay.
That's okay too.
But I'm
And
alive.
back to your question, you've just reminded me of an answer. You said, what have I learned? And I suppose the 24-year-old version of me was like, no, resting and lying down and all those things. Can't do that. That's lazy. But that's me. And that's also social conditioning, which says that resting and all of those things are lazy. They're not. They're absolutely necessary for me to be a better person, in the afternoon, in the morning, whenever. So as well as learning a lot of things about myself and about the disability community, I also did a lot of unlearning over the last 20 or so years.
So you're part of Media Diversity Australia, and you've been featured across platforms from Vogue to Fox to the Sydney Morning Herald. What changes would you love to see across the media landscape in the next 5 years?
Good question. If they'll happen in 5 years, that would be great, but I don't see that happening. So from a few perspectives, language in news media, I would love to see that change. So I've already been part of a few projects that have helped to make that happen. There needs to be a lot more change. So as much as things have changed a little bit, we've got a long way to go. In a nutshell, it comes down to the misrepresentation and the underrepresentation of disability. So we're barely seen across the media, popular culture, advertising. And then if we are seen, it's in really stereotypical tropes like the ones I mentioned before, where either the pitiful victim in an insurance ad or an inspiring Paralympian who has overcome the odds. And that's sort of it, no in between. So I would love to see a more neutral, just day-to-day depiction, authentic depiction of people with disabilities across mainstream media, including advertising and other communication. So to carry that forward, I'm always trying to look for ways to get more people with disabilities employed. So it's not that there aren't people with disabilities in the workforce already. They're just choosing not to disclose. So if I didn't have my wheelchair and you didn't have your walker, people wouldn't know that we have invisible disabilities. I mean, I've got a few other obvious things like missing fingertips, but there are already people with disabilities, neurodivergence, and chronic illness in the workforce. They're just choosing not to disclose, and that's fine, that's their prerogative. But the problem is not the individual. The problem is that society and the workforce does not create a psychologically safe space for them to disclose if they choose to. So I'd like to see, firstly, I want people being employed with disabilities, but secondly, more people who are already in the workforce and perhaps CEOs and managers in leadership positions going, well, you know what? I've got here and I've done it all with a disability, a chronic illness, neurodivergence, whatever the case may be, and feeling comfortable sharing.
That would be really inspiring, because I know that it has occurred in the gender and sexual orientation space, but it would be really good to have people share their neurodivergence, share their, fibromyalgia journey or whatever it is, because our bodies do hold on to all of this pain and everything, and it all aligns with a lot of stress. So, the more normal being able to admit that there is physical discomfort or emotional challenge from a situation, if more senior people did it, then we would feel more comfortable and safer. So the psychological safety in the workplace would be safer.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the benefits of disclosing, if you choose to, are twofold. The people with disabilities, they certainly have a role model. They can look up to you and think, wow, there's someone like me who's a manager or a CEO or a leader. And prior to that, they perhaps didn't have any role models of people with disabilities in leadership positions. So now they do. And secondly, it says to all the non-disabled people in the workforce, people with disabilities are capable, highly skilled, highly talented. Look, here's an example. This person X, is a CEO and have the disability. And it really helps evaporate some of those stereotypes and misconceptions about the disability sector.
Yeah, absolutely. So when organisations talk about diversity, disability is often left behind.
Mm-hmm.
What do they need to understand first before they can get it right?
Okay, a few things, and I'll try and try to remember. First of all, I wanted to mention a Return on Disability report that came out a couple of years ago, and it showed that when interviewed, 90% of companies said, yes, I want to be a part of DEI and diversity, equity, inclusion, all those things. But when the researchers looked closer at the data, they found that only 4% of those initiatives included disability. So while everyone, unless you're in America, everyone's jumping on the DEI bandwagon and go, yeah, let's do this. When it comes to disability, we're being left far, far behind. So that was my first point that I needed to make before I forgot. But secondly, if you are a little bit worried about how best to do it, I want to say just try, but I do recognize that the just give to go or just try can be a bit difficult because there's billions of dollars and people's jobs and stakeholders, all those sorts of things on the line. So it's not just as easy as saying just give it a go, but perhaps get a disability consultant or somebody like that. There are great organizations around like Inclusively Made that can basically hold your hand and help you through the journey, because I come at this as someone who used to be a non-disabled content creator, copywriter. So I made ads, wrote headlines, wrote scripts. And I used to be that person in the advertising agency. It's like, yeah, I know I need to be diverse and inclusive. Shit, I'm scared. I don't want to offend anyone. I don't want to stand on anyone's toes. I was terrified, absolutely terrified. So when business leaders come to me and they've got, wide eyes, and I can see it, like I understand where they're coming from. And I don't believe my role is to lecture them and shame them on social media and say, how would you use that word? Well, there's a place for that sort of action. I'm not the person to do it. So I try and have a chat to them about how best to do it and how that can look given their particular situation.
Yes. And I think, people try to look at these things from a compassionate point of view, try and imagine and do ask experts. There are people who really, really know this stuff, and will have made lots of mistakes as well along the way, because we don't necessarily learn from success.
No, you learn from failures, and I've made heaps of them over the years. So in terms of asking people, you're absolutely correct. Do ask somebody, but ask a disabled person. So not Google or not the guy sitting next to you who happens to have a neighbour or a cousin with disabilities. Ask an actual disabled person or an actually neurodivergent person. They can give you the sorts of information that you're after.
Yes, absolutely. So what is a question you wish people would ask you, but they rarely do?
I could flip that question and say, what is something you wish people would stop asking?
Yes.
Without even friends and family or doctors who need to know. I have no problems answering this question. We'll talk all day. But complete strangers, whenever I'm in an elevator or something like that, never met before. So what's wrong with you? So what happened to you? And I feel like turning around going, that's a good question. How was your last colonoscopy? Or something that's personal information, because little kids are the exception, because I used to be that annoying kid who was like, why is that man in a wheelchair? What happened to your legs? So I was always a bit curious. The kids are the exception, but we're talking about fully grown adults who I've never met before and think it's perfectly okay to say, what happened to you? I certainly don't mind talking about things. I'll talk to you all day about it because you and I know each other. But that's one thing that I wish would change. And I know from experience and speak to other people with disabilities that it's not just art, it's not just me, it's society wide. And going back again, why we need more representation in media, authentic representation. So when people see you with your walker or me with my wheelchair or whatever the case may be, it's not that there's something quote unquote wrong. It's just that things are a bit different for us.
Yes, yes. I know a friend who I interviewed last week, she has changed her greeting language, because when people would see her and say, hi, how are you? She would scan her whole body and check in on it to see what was going on, and then be drawn to the illness or the condition discussion
Ah,
rather than, right? So that was eye-opening for me because
yes.
I've never thought about it. When you ask somebody, how are you? That can, if they've got a chronic condition,
Yeah.
trigger that chronic awareness. And so she's changed it. Hi, nice to see you. On hi, nice to speak to you. So still greeting, still polite,
Yeah.
but not forcing that full body scan that increases our fight and flight response and adrenaline and all of that.
Yeah. I
So,
It's
I,
really, really interesting and true, I suppose. Another reason not to say to strangers in wheelchairs or with other mobility devices what happened to you. Or for me, I'm fine
yes,
to talk about it because I've done it so much over the years. But for some people, it can trigger PTSD or some other trauma response that just sets them off having to talk about it. And again, everybody is different. So just saying, how are you? How's your day? Those sorts of general things. If you wouldn't ask a non-disabled person what's happened to you, what's wrong with you, what was your last pap smear like or prostate exam, don't ask a disabled person. It's sort of the same thing.
yes,
It's personal
yes, that is,
information.
that's right. It's personal.
Yeah,
And, and just because we're disabled does not mean that we don't have a right to have privacy.
that's exactly right. And that's a mistake that I made early on when people did say to me, what's wrong? What happened? I don't like to be deceitful and thought I owed people the truth. I'm like, well, let me tell you about it. And I'd launch into this long winded explanation with every detail. And apart from being exhausting, I realized after a little while that I don't owe people an explanation because in that way, it's almost like a justification. None of us should ever have to justify or explain our existence just because we mobilize differently or think differently.
Yes, absolutely. So, for someone who's just become suddenly different and doesn't recognize their reflection anymore, what would you say to them in the dark?
In the dark, I suppose importantly, I'd say not to have great expectations about the journey being linear. So it's not this, I am sick and now I am better. It's not that linear journey. And again, everybody's different. So it might be a case of, again, drawing on a mistake that I made early on, thinking that I could overcome things and be better and be normal again. Yes, I overcame some really, really big illnesses early on, but overcoming disability and all the other things, that wasn't going to happen. So for me personally, I had to learn to accept that and live comfortably with it and be okay with that. And some of that came from finding purpose. So this might not appeal to everybody, but for me, my purpose and my meaning and my writing is my writing and being able to give back to community in some small way. So that's why I love to advocate. And I lost none of my fingertips, 25% of my eyesight, and my brain's has good bad days. So essentially all the tools of my trade as a professional writer were destroyed. And even though they were all down the drain, I still had this burning desire in me to write. I just had to find a new way. So there were things in my life that I found adaptations for. So I now write every day with two thumbs and a finger. It works. But there are other things that I was like, you know what? If I can't walk or drive or things I can't do, it's okay. Like leading a fulfilling life without a driver's license, that's perfectly okay. So I suppose for everybody it's different. Working out what you want to find adaptations for and still go after and what you can just go, it's right. I can handle life without that. So I've learned to adapt to a lot of things, but others I've just decided life will be better if I stop trying to fight every day to get it back because it's not coming back.
Fantastic wisdom. So, Lisa Cox OAM reminds us that the difference isn't a deficit. It is a dimension of humanity that stretches our empathy, expands our systems, and challenges our stories. Her journey isn't just about survival, It's about redefinition, about choosing to become more when the world expects less. And that choice is not just personal, it's powerful. If you're in media, marketing, or business, Lisa's work is your call to do better. Inclusion isn't a buzzword. It's not a box to tick. It's intelligence, it's innovation, it's integrity. And it's long past time that our media, brands, and boardrooms reflected the full richness of the audience they serve. But beyond strategy and systems, this is also a deeply human story. To anyone listening who's been dismissed, diminished, or doubted, this is your reminder. You don't have to go back to who you were. You can become who you were always meant to be. And that too is leadership. Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm grateful.
Leigh-Anne, beautiful words. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This has been Suddenly Different. I'm Leigh-Anne Charland, and I'm so grateful you shared your time with me. If you felt a spark, a tear, or a moment of recognition, I hope you'll pass that gift along by sharing this show. Take a deep breath, trust your path, and I'll meet you back here soon.